you guys have not seen this already, Brian Shaw just posted his first practice super match that he's ever done that I'm aware of, or at least the most legit one that he's ever done. It is versus Chris KAUFMAN, and this was a best of 5 arm wrestling match. And so I'm really excited to see Brian putting some stuff out like this where he's getting not exactly a super legit ready go, but it's probably as close as he's going to get to something like a King of the Table. He could start going and entering tournaments, but this is probably a better, more controlled environment. And it is a super match format, so it's going to give him that opportunity to make mistakes, make adjustments, everything that he's going to have to do, and a little bit more endurance, just like it will be at King of the Table. Now, right off the go, getting into the first rounds here, what we see Brian doing is pretty much what most people do when they start arm wrestling. They go to practices, they do their lifts, they do all the things. And then when the first ready go happens, they just completely fall asleep. They forget everything that they've ever learned, and then they just get blasted. And this is what happens in round 1. And it's kind of funny to see Brian do this because I think a lot of us have had this exact same experience where you pretty much just fall asleep and then you wake up and they tell you that you lost. And then you're wondering why you did the exact opposite technique that you've always done. It's just kind of a very interesting, surreal experience. And this is what Brian does. He just takes a super low grip and tries to hold on. Just terrible arm wrestling, and I'm sure that he's well aware of this, and he changes his technique completely up right after this. Very good to get these ready goes out of the way before something like King of the Table happens, to get the nerves out. So moving on to the second round, what we're going to see now is Brian's going to totally change up his setup, a lot more back pressure, a lot less holding on, and when this go happens, I like this so much better. You can see Brian kind of sweeping out a little bit, aiming his knuckles at his opponents, keeping his wrist rise high, and he is forcing Chris to hold on to him here. This just looks so much better, and you can see all that pressure is going up into Chris's fingertips. Now, something I don't like is that after the go, we see Brian really holding on here. I would have liked him to just basically continue to slip and force his opponent to hold on to him. This is something that I don't know a lot about. Holding on to your opponent like this in terms of grip strength, it would seem like that could potentially be a really good thing or a really bad thing, depending on the grip that you get. Maybe you could gas your opponent out more so by getting a lot of leverage and extending their elbow flexor, maybe extending their radial deviation. But it seems like you could also just blow up your own hand and wrist. You could really blow up your forearm and make it impossible for you to cup in the later rounds. We've seen people like Vitaly Laletin having success with this, but normally what he does is he kind of does a half slip and then grabs onto his opponent's fingertips. He's not really grabbing onto the thumb as much as Brian is, from what I've seen. So I don't really like this. I don't think that there's a great use case for this, and especially when he's going up against stronger opponents. I wouldn't want to see Brian grabbing on with his fingers like this, but who knows, maybe this will be effective against Eddie Hall. I think they end up slipping. And then we're going to go to straps. Now, this round right here is my favorite round of this whole thing from Brian. And this, to me, is perfect. This is exactly what I would want to see Brian doing. He's in referee's grip. And what you're going to see, and you can see the depth of grip that Brian is able to achieve here. You can see how far past his opponent's arm his knuckle is. And you can just see, as soon as they say go, Chris has no ability, Brian's opponent has no ability to go up and over the top because Brian has just essentially put this super strong hammer curl out here. And from the get-go, he has access to attacking his opponent's fingertips. He is forcing his opponent to hold on to him. And you can just see it all happen as soon as they say go. Boom. And then immediately Brian's opponent is just underneath him. He has absolutely nothing. This guy is the one that is holding on to Brian. Chris is holding on to Brian. And you can see him having to lat drag. Immediately, he's underneath. He's lost everything. It's subtle, but he's already lost his pronation, his cup. Brian is the one controlling the battle of efficiency. Brian could pin here. He could continue to climb. He could cup. There's so many things he could do. He could start to supinate and regrip and get into a more efficient position where he could gas his opponent out. But the match is already over, essentially from the go, because Brian achieved the setup he needed to use his super strong hammer strength to attack his opponent's fingertips. Now, just because Brian has that pressure, he's going to have to get the setup where he can actually use it. And in this round, he did get that setup. There are other rounds where he doesn't really get the setup so much. Like in the first round, His back pressure didn't really do anything because he didn't have the correct setup in order to apply it where it needed to be applied. But this round is just perfect. If Brian happens to see this, please do this over and over again. This round 2, I think this is perfect. And then Brian just takes him right to the pin pad, and you can see Brian's opponent never has any access to his power. This is what I want to see from someone like Brian, who has such a long arm, such a big hand, to just completely disengage his opponent's power. I don't really want to see Brian trying to clamp down and just dominate every single lane. I just want to see him going straight up into the air and forcing his opponent to hold on to him. And then they're just going to be left with no power. They're going to look confused like this. And you can see how easy that is. I think that is by far his best round in the super match. Now, after this, we're going to see Brian kind of going back to holding on a lot more. And you can see in this round, his opponent gets a much better, a much higher grip. His knuckle is way, way higher than Brian's. And Brian's kind of going back to containing. To me, if you have that super long arm, I don't really want to see you containing. I would much rather see you forcing your opponent to contain you. You can see him essentially doing a wrist curl. Now, once he kind of contains, he actually does reverse it and go over the top. And you can just see how strong Brian is, and that's why he does end up winning this super match, is just because of his brute strength. He just clamps down, he contains his opponent outside of straps, and then you can see him just gently peel open his opponent's elbow flexor. So in terms of power, Brian's looking amazing. He ends up kind of even turning it into a hook a little bit at the end there, bringing his shoulder a little forward. So this is something Brian can do, but my issue is this is just not efficient. This is a way that Brian can win if he's just way stronger than his opponent. But if the match is really close, say that Eddie Hall does end up being very comparable to Brian Shaw in strength, I wouldn't want to see him doing this. I would want to see Brian using the strategy he used in round 2. I think that that would be so much more effective than trying to contain and then reverse it and then go over the top. You might as well just go over the top to begin with. And then in rounds, I think this is the final round here. We're going to see once again a lot of holding on, a lot of clamping from Brian Shaw. I don't feel like this is the best thing for him to be doing, but he does have a massive hand and super good grip strength, but you can see him, he is kind of getting climbed over the top of here. I just can't imagine that this is the best position for Brian to be in. I would just top roll as high and as strongly as possible. And if his opponent holds on to him, then great, and he'll just get a free pin. But I probably wouldn't be trying to clamp on and catch like this, especially someone of Brian's stature. I would just go all the way over the top, force your opponent to hold on. And this is going to be, we're going to have multiple fouls here. This is going to come back. And then in the final round, maybe a little bit better. He is kind of sweeping out and forcing his opponent to hold on a little bit, but in terms of the vector that he's pulling at. But the problem is he's not really allowing that slip to occur because he's clamping down. If Brian didn't clamp down, then he would be slipping into his opponent's fingertips. But because he's clamping onto his opponent's thumb, I would think he's probably getting tired more quickly as far as the hand and wrist goes. And you can see him giving access to his opponent to climb there. So to me, this is just Brian being insanely strong. But like I said, I don't think it's the most optimal technique for him. If you wanted to set Brian up with the ability to beat someone that is the very best possible opponent he could beat, or in other words, if Brian was the weaker guy, how should he arm wrestle? Brian is arm wrestling like he's the far stronger guy. But to me, you should always arm wrestle as if you are the weaker guy, because then you're choosing the lane that makes you the most efficient. You're maximizing the strength that you do have. And if you combine that with the fact that Brian is insanely strong just in general, to me, that's going to be the best thing for him. Great example is, of course, someone like Levon. Levon can dominate people. He can do things like this, but sometimes he does something like what he did versus Devin Larratt, where he gives a little bit of his fundamental strengths away. He maybe allows his wrist to crack back just slightly so that he can force his opponent to hold on to him. That's what I would like to see from Brian. Maybe a flat wrist top roll, just like we saw in round 2, where he sweeps to the outside, and then he forces his opponent to hold on. So Brian does end up winning. He does kind of climb over the top here, but to me, these are not the most ideal rounds. Going back to look at round 2 just one more time, this is so perfect to me. You can just see, and he doesn't even have to do it with a cracked wrist. He can keep his wrist slightly cupped if he wants to. But you can just see right off the go how Brian's opponent just totally has to hold on. This is all because of Brian's setup. If he sets up perfect and he doesn't try to clamp down with his wrist, he doesn't try to hold on, but he simply is going this in this direction right here, either straight up or straight up and back. And he has this deep grip with his massive hand and his long arm. No one's going to be able to go up and over the top of him unless they just have one of the strongest elbow flexors in the world. It's going to be extremely difficult. Brian would be maybe more vulnerable to someone trying to hook him or someone trying to flop press him. But if they're trying to go over the top with a much shorter arm, that's going to be super, super difficult. So I would love to see more of this from Brian Shaw. Overall, super, super impressed. For a first super match, I think this is great. A lot of people look way, way worse in their first super match. But yeah, round 2 was extremely impressive to me. But let me know what you guys thought about this. Which round do you think Brian looked the best in? And how do you think that this kind of shapes his chances against Eddie Hall? Are you more confident or less confident after seeing these practice super matches? All right, thank you guys so much for watching. I'll talk to you later.